大家好，我是 Jenny， 欢迎来到沉思者 J。今天我们要说一个故事，这是两个哲学巨人的故事。他们曾经是最好的朋友，后来却变成最有名的敌人。一个叫卡牟，一个叫沙特。他们的决裂震动了整个欧洲。这场决裂到今天还有人在谈。这不只是两个人的吵架，这是两种人生态度的对决。故事要从巴黎说起。那是一个咖啡馆的年代，第二次世界大战刚刚结束，巴黎的左岸充满思想的火花。读书人坐在咖啡馆里，他们抽烟，他们喝酒，他们争论，他们相信文字可以改变世界。卡牟和沙特就是其中的明星，那真是一个迷人的时代。我们先来认识卡牟。卡牟出生在1913年，他的家乡不在法国本土，而是在北非的阿尔及利亚。他的家境非常贫穷，父亲在他出生不久就死了，死在第一次世界大战的战场上。卡牟几乎没见过自己的父亲，他只知道父亲是个穷苦的工人，他的母亲是个了不起的女人，但是他几乎听不见也很少说话。他没有受过教育，他靠帮人打扫维持生活。卡牟从小就住在工人区，他和母亲外婆挤在小公寓里，外婆非常严厉，家里连一本书都很少。但是这个穷孩子有一个天赋，他的脑袋特别聪明。他遇到了一位好老师，这位老师叫做杰曼。杰曼一眼就看出卡牟的才华，他帮卡牟争取到奖学金，卡牟因此能够继续读书，这在当时是很难得的事。穷人家的孩子很少能升学。多年以后，卡牟得了大奖，他第一个想到的就是这位老师。他写了一封感谢信给杰曼，这份师生情谊让很多人感动。年轻的卡牟热爱足球，他是球队的守门员。他常说一句有趣的话，他说自己对道德的理解全都是从足球学来的。他也热爱阳光和大海，阿尔及利亚的阳光非常炙热，这片土地塑造了他的灵魂。他骨子里是个热情的人，可惜他得了肺结核，这个病改变了他的一生。那个年代肺结核很可怕，他常常咳血躺在病床上，他不能再踢球了，他也不能正常工作，死亡很早就靠近了他。正因为这样，他开始拼命思考生命的意义，他开始大量阅读和写作。卡牟很早就思考一个问题，人生到底有没有意义？这个宇宙会回应我们吗？他在大学读的是哲学，他研究古希腊的思想，他也研究早期的基督教，但是他得到的答案很冷酷。宇宙是沉默的，宇宙根本不在乎我们。人拼命寻找意义，世界却什么都不回答。我们渴望被理解，天地却一片冰冷。这种巨大的矛盾，卡牟把它叫做荒谬。荒谬不是说事情很好笑，荒谬是指那种落差，人有渴望，世界却无动于衷。荒谬是卡牟思想的核心。那么，面对荒谬该怎么办？有人说那就干脆死掉吧，反正活着也没有意义。卡牟坚决反对这个想法，他说自杀是一种投降，那等于向荒谬认输。真正的勇气是继续活下去，明知没有意义还是要活，而且要活得轰轰烈烈。卡牟用一个神话来说明，这是西西弗斯的故事。西西弗斯被天神惩罚，他要把一块大石头推上山顶，可是石头一到山顶就滚下来，他必须永远重复这件事，推上去，滚下来，再推上去。这听起来多么绝望！可是卡牟说了一句名言，我们应该想象西西弗斯是快乐的。这句话的意思很深，人生其实就像推石头，看起来没有尽头，看起来没有结果，但是推石头的这个过程，这个反抗命运的姿态，本身就有了意义，那就是人的尊严所在，那也是人的幸福所在。这就是卡牟的荒谬哲学。卡牟写了很多伟大的作品，其中最有名的一本叫做《异乡人》。故事的主角非常冷漠，他对母亲的死没有眼泪，他不假装悲伤，后来他甚至杀了一个人，理由竟然是因为阳光太刺眼。这个角色震惊了所有读者。 他活在自己的真实里，他拒绝扮演社会要他演的戏。卡蒙还写过一本书叫做《瘟疫》，这本书讲一座城市爆发鼠疫，人们被封锁在城里，有人逃避，有人崩溃，但也有医生选择留下来奋战，明知道可能治不好，还是日复一日地救人。这正是卡蒙心中的英雄，在荒谬里依然选择善良。这里有一个有趣的地方，很多人把卡蒙当成存在主义者，但是卡蒙自己并不接受这个标签。他说他不是一个哲学家，他只是一个热爱生命的作家。他的荒谬和沙特的存在主义其实有着微妙的不同，这个差别后来酿成了大风暴。1957年卡蒙得到一个大奖，那就是诺贝尔文学奖。那一年他才44岁，他是史上很年轻的得主之一。面对这份巨大的荣耀，他显得格外谦虚。他说这个奖让他感到不安，他觉得有更值得的人没有得到。这份谦逊让人更加敬重他。晚年的卡蒙写过一本书叫做《堕落》，书里的主角不断地忏悔，也不断地审判别人。那是卡蒙最黑暗的一本书，他看穿了人心的虚伪，他也对自己充满怀疑。伟大的思想家也会迷惘。现在我们来认识沙特。沙特比卡蒙大8岁，他出生在1905年的巴黎。他的出身和卡蒙很不一样，卡蒙是穷人家的孩子，沙特却是书香门第。他从小就泡在书堆里，他的外公家里藏书丰富，他2、3岁就开始翻书了。说起沙特的外公也很有名，他姓史怀哲，和那位著名的史怀哲医生是亲戚。沙特很小就失去了父亲，他是被外公带大的，外公对他寄予厚望，书本成了他最好的玩具。他从小就活在文字的世界里。沙特念的是顶尖学校，那是巴黎高等师范学院，法国最聪明的脑袋都在那里。就在那所学校里，他遇见了一生的伴侣，这个人叫做西蒙波娃，他也是了不起的思想家。他后来写了一本重要的书，那本书谈的是女性的处境。他们2个人约定终身，但是他们从不结婚，他们维持一种自由的关系。沙特长得并不好看，他个子矮小又有斜视，但是他的头脑光芒四射，他讲起话来滔滔不绝，他充满了惊人的魅力，许多人被他深深吸引，他成了那个时代的偶像，年轻人把他当成精神导师。沙特的哲学叫做存在主义，他有一句最有名的话，存在先于本质。这句话听起来很玄，我来帮大家解释一下。我们拿一把刀来举例，一把刀在被造出来之前，工匠就想好它要用来切东西，所以刀的用途先被决定了，这叫做本质先于存在。但是人完全不一样，人先来到这个世界，然后才慢慢决定自己是谁。没有人天生注定要做神魔，你不是被设计好的工具，你的人生由你自己选择，你的每一个决定都在塑造你成为神模样的人，这就是存在先于本质。沙特说人是自由的，而且是被迫自由的，这是什么意思呢？意思是你无法逃避选择，就算你决定什么都不做，那本身也是一种选择。这份自由其实很沉重，因为你要为一切负责，没有任何人能替你扛。沙特还有一句名言，他在一出剧本里写道，他人就是地狱。很多人误会这句话，以为是说别人很讨厌，其实意思更加深刻。我们总是活在别人的眼光里，别人怎么看我们，会变成一种无形的枷锁，我们很容易迷失在那目光中。沙特也写过一本小说叫《呕吐》，书里的主角看着一棵树根，忽然感到一阵强烈的恶心。他发现万物的存在没有理由，一切都是多余的偶然。这种感受让他天旋地转，这正是存在主义的起点。先看见虚无，再决定怎么活。沙特还提出一个有趣的概念，他把它叫做自欺。他举了一个咖啡馆服务生的例子，那个服务生动作很夸张，他演得太像一个服务生了，仿佛他天生就只能是服务生。沙特说这就是自欺。 他用一个角色来逃避自由，他假装自己没有别的选择，其实他随时都可以离开。好了，两位主角都出场了，现在他们要相遇了。时间是二战期间的巴黎，那时城市被纳粹占领，两个才华洋溢的年轻人很自然地走到了一起。沙特很欣赏卡繆的小说，卡繆也佩服沙特的思想，他们一见如故，他们成了最好的朋友。那是一段黄金岁月，他们常常在咖啡馆高谈阔论，他们一起对抗纳粹的压迫。卡繆主编一份地下报纸，那份报纸叫做《战斗报》，他用文字鼓舞人心，他冒着生命危险写作。战争结束以后，他们成了法国的精神领袖，全世界的年轻人都崇拜他们，他们的书一本接一本畅销。他们最爱去的是花神咖啡馆，还有附近的双手咖啡馆，那里是思想家的聚集地。波娃也常常和他们在一起，他们一桌人天南地北地聊，从文学聊到政治，从爱情聊到自由，那是一段纯真的友谊。谁也想不到后来会反目成仇。其实这两个人个性差很多，卡繆热情而感性，他像地中海的阳光，温暖却又带着一点忧郁。沙特冷静而理性，他像一台精密的思考机器，一个用心去感受世界，一个用脑去分析世界。也许正因为太不一样，他们最后才会走向决裂。那时的他们意气风发，他们一起喝酒，一起跳舞，他们一起讨论到深夜，他们相信一个更好的世界，他们以为友谊会天长地久。可是命运另有安排，裂痕慢慢出现了，而且越裂越大。问题出在政治上，那是一个冷战的年代，世界分成两个阵营，一边是西方的民主国家，一边是苏联的共产阵营。许多读书人同情共产主义，他们向往一个人人平等的世界，他们痛恨资本主义的不公，这在当时是一股巨大的潮流。沙特就是这样的人，他越来越靠近共产阵营，他相信为的是更好的未来，有时候必须使用激烈的手段，革命难免会流血，他认为这是必要的代价，他愿意站在革命这一边，即使革命也有黑暗的一面，他觉得历史会证明一切。可是卡繆完全不同意，卡繆亲眼见过战争的残酷，他无法接受任何形式的暴力，他发现苏联有可怕的劳改营，无数人被关押被虐待，无数人在那里受苦死去。卡繆说这是绝对不能容忍的，他认为再美好的理想都不值得用无辜者的血去换。两个人的分歧越来越深，一个追求结果，一个坚持原则，一个说要先改变世界，一个说不能弄脏双手。这场争论越来越紧张，就像两块大陆慢慢分开，谁也不肯退让，火山随时准备爆发。1951年卡繆出了一本书，书名叫做《反抗者》。在这本书里，他严厉批判革命的暴力，他说有些革命走向了恐怖，打着理想的旗号杀害无辜，他质疑那些杀人的革命家。这本书等于是公开的挑战，他正好戳中沙特那一派的痛处。沙特的圈子非常生气，他主编一本重要的杂志，杂志名叫《现代》，杂志里刊出一篇很长的书评，这篇文章狠狠地骂了卡繆。写文章的人叫做让松，但是大家心里都明白，这篇文章代表沙特的立场，这是经过沙特同意的攻击。卡繆气坏了，他写了一封很长的信回应。有趣的是，他根本不理会让松，他直接把信写给主编，也就是直接挑战沙特本人。信里充满了骄傲和愤怒，他觉得自己被老朋友背叛了，他觉得对方根本不讲道理，他要捍卫自己的尊严。接下来就是致命的一击，沙特亲自写了回信，这封信非常无情，也非常犀利。他攻击卡繆的骄傲，他嘲笑卡繆的道德姿态，他说卡繆把自己当成正义的化身，他说卡繆活在自己的世界里。然后他写下一句让人心碎的话，他说我们的友谊并不容易，但是我会怀念他。这几个字宣告料结束，两个最好的朋友 从此再也没有说过一句话。整个巴黎都在看这场决裂，报纸杂志天天讨论，大家都选边站，有人挺沙特，有人挺卡繆。这不只是两个人的争吵，这是两种世界观的对决，这也是两种良心的对决。到底谁对谁错呢？这个问题很难回答。沙特关心的是改变世界，他愿意为理想弄脏双手。卡繆关心的是守住底线，他宁愿保持纯洁也不愿妥协。一个看重历史的大方向，一个坚持眼前的每一条人命。其实两个人都有他们的道理。这场决裂也让波娃很痛苦。他和卡繆本来也是朋友，但是他选择站在沙特这一边，从此三个人形同陌路，一段美好的情谊就这样彻底碎裂了。这就是理念冲突的代价。时间给了我们一些答案。后来苏联的真相一一揭露，劳改营的恐怖被完全证实了。许多当年支持共产的人，最后都感到深深的后悔。从这个角度来看，卡繆的警告其实很有远见。他很早就看穿了集权的危险，他守住了人性的底线。卡繆始终为自由发声。当匈牙利人民起来反抗，却被苏联的坦克镇压，卡繆站出来大声抗议。他从不因为立场而沉默，他关心的是具体的每一个人，而不是抽象的口号。但是沙特也有他的伟大，他一生都在为弱者发声，他关心被压迫被欺负的人，他参与各种社会运动，他甚至拒绝了诺贝尔文学奖。那是1964年的事，因为他不想被体制收编，他不想变成官方的招牌，他活成了一个真正的斗士。他的热情感动了无数人。故事还有一个悲伤的结尾。1960年的某一天，卡繆死于一场车祸。那一年他才46岁，他正处在创作的高峰。他3年前才拿到诺贝尔奖。更让人唏嘘的是，他的口袋里有一张火车票。他本来打算坐火车的，最后却临时改搭朋友的车。命运开了一个残酷的玩笑，他们到死都没有和好。听到卡繆的死讯，沙特非常难过。虽然他们早已绝交，虽然他们多年没有往来，但是沙特写了一篇悼念文章，字里行间充满了感情。他说卡繆代表了一种倔强的人道精神。他承认自己一直惦记着这位老友，看来在心底最深的地方，沙特从来没有真正忘记卡繆。也许他也曾经后悔过吧。卡繆走后，沙特又活了20年。他晚年几乎双眼失明，但是他从未停止思考。他一直站在抗议的最前线。1980年沙特去世了。那一天巴黎万人空巷，将近5万人为他送行，人们挤满了整条街道。他是一个时代的象征。这个故事告诉我们什么呢？两个天才因为信念而决裂，他们都想让世界变得更好，只是走的路完全不同。这让我想到一件事，真诚的分歧并不可怕，真正可怕的是放弃思考，是人云亦云随波逐流。卡繆和沙特至少都很真诚，他们都为自己的信念付出了代价。荒谬主义和存在主义其实是同一个问题的两个答案。这个问题就是，在一个没有神的世界里，人到底该怎么活下去？沙特的答案是靠自由的选择，你就是你选择的总和。卡繆的答案是靠不屈的反抗，带着清醒继续热爱生命。他们都拒绝欺骗自己，他们都勇敢面对虚无。其实这两种哲学并不矛盾，我们的人生里都需要他们。有时候我们需要沙特的勇气，勇敢地做出选择并且承担。有时候我们需要卡繆的清醒，在荒谬里依然保持善良。一个教我们如何行动，一个教我们如何坚守。两位大师留下的智慧，直到今天依然闪闪发光。今天当我们感到迷惘的时候，当我们觉得人生失去意义，这两位大师依然在对我们说话。沙特会说站起来去选择吧，你的人生掌握在自己手中，你就是你选择成为的那个人。卡繆会说继续推你的石头吧，并且要带着微笑去推，要想象西西弗斯是快乐的。好了，今天的故事就到这里。 卡繆和沙特的友谊与决裂，是哲学史上最动人的一页。它提醒我们思想是有重量的，它提醒我们选择是有代价的，它也提醒我们，真正的朋友也可能因理念而分开。愿我们都能像他们一样，真诚地面对自己的人生，勇敢地做出自己的选择，然后温柔地对待身边的人。谢谢大家的收看。如果你喜欢这个故事，记得帮我按赞和订阅哦。也欢迎在留言区告诉我，你站在卡繆这边，还是站在沙特这边？我们下次见咯。Hello everyone, I'm Jenny. Welcome to Thinker J. Today I want to tell you a story, and it is one of my favorites in the whole history of ideas. It is the story of two giants of philosophy. They were once the closest of friends, the kind of friends who finish each other's sentences. Later they became the most famous enemies of their entire age. One of them was named Camus. The other was named Sartre. When their friendship finally shattered, all of Europe felt the shock of it. People are still talking about that rupture today, more than 70 years later. So please understand, this is not simply a tale of two men having a quarrel. It is a clash between two whole ways of facing life. It is a question about how any of us should live when the world stops making sense. The story begins in Paris. It was the great age of the café, a time when a wooden table and a cup of coffee could become the center of the universe. The Second World War had just ended, and the city was exhausted but electric. The left bank of Paris was crackling with ideas. Thinkers and writers and artists packed into smoky little cafes. They smoked. They drank cheap wine. They argued for hours and hours. They genuinely believed that words could change the world, that a single essay could shake a government. Camus and Sartre were the two brightest stars of that whole glittering scene. It really was an enchanting time to be young and alive and full of opinions. Let us first get to know Camus. Albert Camus was born in 1913. His home was not in mainland France at all. It was in Algeria, in North Africa, in a small town near the coast. His family was desperately poor, poorer than most of us can easily imagine. His father died not long after Camus was born. He was killed on the battlefield of the First World War, when little Albert was less than a year old. So Camus barely knew his own father. All he ever knew was that his father had been a poor laborer who went off to a war he did not start and never came home. His mother was a truly remarkable woman, though her life was painfully hard. She could hardly hear, and she rarely spoke more than a few words. She had never received any education at all. She kept the family alive by cleaning other people's houses, scrubbing floors for a few coins. Camus grew up in a cramped working-class district of the city. He, his mother, and his grandmother all squeezed into one tiny apartment with no running water and no electricity for years. His grandmother was very strict, sometimes harsh. There was barely a single book in the entire home. And yet this poor, silent, sunburned boy carried an extraordinary gift inside him. His mind was unusually sharp, hungry, and quick. Then something happened that changed everything. He met a wonderful teacher. The teacher was named Louis Germain. Germain saw the boy's rare talent at a single glance, the way a jeweler spots a diamond in the dirt. He helped Camus win a scholarship to continue his studies. Because of that one act of kindness, Camus was able to stay in school. In those days that was almost a miracle. Children of poor families almost never went on to higher education. They went to work in the fields or the factories. Many years later, when Camus won one of the greatest prizes in the world, the very first person he thought of was this teacher. He sat down and wrote a heartfelt letter of thanks to old Germain. That bond between student and teacher has moved countless people ever since, and honestly it still moves me every time I think about it. The young Camus loved football with all his heart. He played as the goalkeeper for his university team, the last line of defense, alone in front of the net. He once said something rather charming about this. He said that everything he truly understood about morality and duty, he had learned from football, from the team, from showing up for the people who counted on him. He also loved the sun and the sea with a fierce devotion. The sunlight of Algeria is blazing and almost violent, and the Mediterranean is impossibly blue. That land of light and water shaped his very soul. Deep down, beneath all the philosophy, he was a passionate, sensual, sun-loving man. But then sadness arrived. He fell ill with tuberculosis while he was still very young. That disease changed the entire course of his life. In those years tuberculosis was a terrifying, often fatal illness, and there was no reliable cure. He often lay in a sickbed coughing up blood, wondering if each year would be his last. He could no longer play football. He could not even hold a normal steady job. Death drew very close to him very early, and it never really left his side. And precisely because of this constant nearness of death, he began to think hard, almost obsessively, about the meaning of life. He began to read and to write with a burning intensity, as if he were racing the clock. Camus wrestled early with one enormous question. Does life have any meaning at all? Is there a point to any of it? Will this vast universe ever answer us when we cry out? At university he studied philosophy seriously. He explored the thought of ancient Greece, the calm and the tragic together. He also studied early Christianity and its hopes of salvation. But the answer he finally arrived at was cold and hard and honest. The universe is silent. The stars do not speak. The universe simply does not care about us, not one bit. Think about what that really means. Human beings search desperately, their whole lives, for meaning and purpose. Yet the world gives no reply at all. We long to be understood and loved by something larger than ourselves. The cosmos remains icy and utterly indifferent. This enormous and painful contradiction is exactly what Camus called the absurd. Now be careful here. The absurd does not mean that something is funny or silly. It points to that aching gap between what we want and what we get. We yearn for sense, and the world stays completely unmoved. We knock, and no one answers. That, for Camus, is the absurd. The absurd sits at the very heart of everything Camus wrote. So the great question becomes, what should we actually do when we face it honestly? Some people say we should simply give up and die. After all, they reason, if life truly has no meaning, then why bother continuing? Camus firmly and passionately rejected that idea. He said that suicide is a form of surrender, a white flag raised to the universe. It means admitting total defeat to the absurd. The true courage, he argued, is to keep on living anyway. To live fully even while knowing there is no built-in meaning waiting for us. And not just to survive, but to live with passion, intensity, and even joy. To explain all this, Camus reached back to an ancient myth. It is the story of Sisyphus. Sisyphus was a man punished by the gods for his defiance. His punishment was this. He had to push a huge boulder all the way up a steep mountain. But the very moment the boulder reached the top, it would roll right back down to the bottom. And so he had to push it up again. And again. And again, forever, with no end and no reward. Push it up. Watch it roll down. Walk back down. Push it up once more. How utterly hopeless and crushing that sounds. And yet Camus wrote one of the most famous lines in all of philosophy. We must imagine Sisyphus happy. That single line carries an ocean of meaning. Life, Camus is telling us, is really a lot like pushing that boulder. It can seem to have no final end. It can seem to lead nowhere in particular. We get up, we work, we sleep, we get up again. But here is the secret. The act of pushing the boulder itself, that very posture of defiance against a meaningless fate, becomes the source of meaning. When Sisyphus chooses to own his task, when he refuses to be crushed by it, he becomes greater than his punishment. That is exactly where human dignity lives. That is also where a strange and stubborn human happiness lives. And this, in a nutshell, is the absurdist philosophy of Camus. Camus poured these ideas into many great works. The most famous of them all is a slim novel called The Stranger. The main character is strangely cold and emotionally detached. He sheds no tears at his own mother's funeral. He refuses to fake any sorrow at all, even when everyone expects it. Later, almost by accident, he even kills a man on a sun-blasted beach. And the reason he gives for the killing is almost unbelievable. He says it was because the sunlight was too blinding and too hot. That character shocked and unsettled every reader who met him. He lives only inside his own raw truth. He flatly refuses to perform the role that society demands of him, and society punishes him for it. Camus also wrote a powerful book called The Plague. The book tells of a sealed city suddenly struck by a deadly outbreak of plague. The gates are locked, and the people are trapped inside with the disease and with each other. Some of them try to escape. Some fall completely apart in fear. But there are also doctors who quietly choose to stay and fight. They know full well that they may not be able to cure a single patient. Still they show up and save people, day after exhausting day, asking for no reward. This is the true hero in the heart of Camus. Not a Superman, but an ordinary person who simply chooses goodness and decency even in the middle of the absurd. Now here is an interesting and important twist. Many people, then and now, label Camus an existentialist and file him next to Sartre. But Camus himself never accepted that label. He pushed it away. He said he was not really a philosopher at all in the formal sense. He was simply a writer who loved life and tried to be honest about it. His idea of the absurd and Sartre's idea of existentialism were subtly but deeply different things. Hold on to that difference, because that small crack would later grow into an enormous storm between the two men. In 1957, Camus received one of the greatest honors a writer can receive. It was the Nobel Prize in Literature. That year he was only 44 years old, which made him one of the youngest winners in the entire history of the prize. And yet, faced with all that glory and attention, he stayed remarkably humble. He said openly that the prize left him feeling uneasy rather than proud. He felt that other, more deserving people had been overlooked. That deep humility, in a world full of vanity, made people respect him even more. In his later years, Camus wrote a strange and brilliant book called The Fall. The main character confesses his own sins again and again, in a long barroom monologue. And at the same time he passes harsh judgment on everyone around him. It is the darkest, most uncomfortable book Camus ever wrote. He saw straight through the hypocrisy that hides in the human heart, including his own. He was also filled with genuine doubt about himself. It is a good reminder that even the greatest thinkers can lose their way and question everything. Now let us turn and get to know Sartre. Jean-Paul Sartre was 8 years older than Camus. He was born in Paris in 1905, right in the heart of the city. His background could hardly have been more different from Camus'. Camus was a child of the silent, sunburned poor. Sartre came from a cultured, comfortable, literary family. He was surrounded by books from his earliest days. His grandfather's house was practically a private library. He started turning pages and pretending to read at 2 or 3 years old, long before he understood the words. Sartre's grandfather was a somewhat famous man in his own right. His family name was Schweitzer. He was in fact a relative of the celebrated doctor and humanitarian Albert Schweitzer. Sartre lost his own father when he was just a baby. So he was raised mainly by his mother and this learned grandfather. The old man placed enormous hopes in the clever little boy. In that house, books became his favorite and almost only toys. From his earliest childhood, Sartre lived inside the world of words and stories and ideas. It was the world he understood best. Sartre went on to attend the finest school in the country. It was the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, the training ground for the brightest minds in all of France. And it was at that very school that he met the partner of his entire life. Her name was Simone de Beauvoir. She was not just his companion. She too was a brilliant and original thinker in her own right. She would later write a hugely important book that examined the condition and the freedom of women, a book that helped launch modern feminism. The two of them pledged themselves to each other for life. But they deliberately never married. Instead they kept a free, open, and unconventional kind of relationship that scandalized and fascinated people in equal measure. Sartre, it must be said, was not exactly handsome. He was very short, and he had a wandering eye that pointed off to one side. But none of that mattered, because his mind blazed with light. When he opened his mouth and began to speak, the words poured out endlessly, brilliantly, dazzlingly. He radiated an astonishing kind of charisma that had nothing to do with looks. People were drawn to him powerfully, helplessly. He became a genuine idol of his time. Young people all over Europe treated him as a kind of spiritual guide and rock star rolled into one. Sartre's philosophy is called existentialism. He had one most famous saying that you may have heard before. Existence precedes essence. Now that line sounds rather mysterious and abstract, so let me try to bring it down to earth. Take a simple knife as our example. Before a knife is ever forged, the craftsman already knows exactly what it is for. He knows it is meant for cutting. So the purpose, the essence of the knife, is fully decided before the knife even exists. We call that essence preceding existence. The plan comes first, then the object. But a human being, Sartre insisted, is completely the opposite. A person first arrives in the world, raw and undefined, with no instruction manual. Only afterward, through living, do they slowly decide who they are. No one is born destined or designed to be any one particular thing. You are not a tool stamped out for a fixed purpose. Your life is something you build and choose for yourself, day by day. Every single decision you make is actively shaping the kind of person you are becoming. This is what it means to say that, for a human being, existence comes first and essence comes later. Sartre then said something both thrilling and frightening. He said that human beings are free. And not just free, but condemned to be free. What on earth does that strange phrase mean? It means that you simply cannot escape from choosing. There is no exit from responsibility. Even if you decide to do nothing at all, even if you refuse to choose, that refusal is itself a choice you have made. This freedom, Sartre warned, is actually a very heavy burden to carry. Because it means you must take full responsibility for everything you do and everything you become. No one else can carry that weight for you. No God, no fate, no excuse. Sartre had another famous line, one that has been quoted and misquoted endlessly. He wrote it in one of his plays. Hell is other people. Now many people badly misunderstand this line. They think it simply means that other people are annoying and that we would be happier alone. But the real meaning runs much deeper than that. Sartre is pointing out that we are always living under the gaze of other people. The way others see us, judge us, and define us can become an invisible chain around our necks. We start to see ourselves only through their eyes. And it is terribly, dangerously easy to lose our own true selves inside that endless gaze. Sartre also wrote a haunting novel called Nausea. In one famous scene, the main character sits in a park and stares at the gnarled root of a chestnut tree. And suddenly he is gripped by a wave of sickening dread, an almost physical nausea. He realizes, all at once, that the existence of all these things around him has no reason behind it. The tree, the bench, his own hand, all of it is simply there, a sheer surplus, a meaningless accident. That overwhelming feeling makes his head spin. And this, strangely, is the true starting point of existentialism. First you must see the void clearly and honestly. Only then can you decide how you are going to live. Sartre also proposed another fascinating and useful idea. He called it bad faith, or self-deception. He gave a wonderful example of a cafe waiter. The waiter moves a little too smoothly, a little too eagerly. He balances his tray with exaggerated care. He performs the role of a waiter just a bit too perfectly, as if he were nothing more than a waiter, as if he had been born to do this and could be nothing else. Sartre said this is exactly bad faith. The man is using a fixed role to flee from his own terrifying freedom. He is pretending to himself that he has no other choice in life. But the truth is that he could take off the apron and walk out the door at any single moment. He just does not want to face that. Well then, both of our heroes have now stepped onto the stage. Now, at last, it is time for them to meet. The setting is Paris in the middle of the war. The beautiful city was under brutal Nazi occupation. Two young men, both brimming with talent and ambition, came together quite naturally in that tense, dangerous atmosphere. Sartre had already deeply admired the early novels of Camus and had even praised them in print. Camus, in his turn, respected the powerful and systematic thinking of Sartre. They clicked from the very first meeting. They became, for a glorious while, the closest of friends. It was a golden chapter in both of their lives. They often talked and argued late into the night in their favorite cafes. They fought together, in their own way, against Nazi oppression. Camus bravely edited an underground resistance newspaper. The newspaper was called Combat. Through its pages he used his words to lift the spirits of an occupied people, and he literally risked his life to keep it running, since the Nazis executed people for far less. After the war finally ended, the two friends became something like the spiritual leaders of a whole new France. Young people across the entire world looked up to them and copied them. Their books became bestsellers one after another. Their absolute favorite spot was the Café de Flore. There was also the famous Café Les Domingos just nearby. These two cafes were the beating heart and gathering place of the thinking world. Beauvoir was very often there alongside them, an equal in every conversation. The whole table would talk passionately about everything under the sun. They would move from literature to politics in a single breath. From the nature of love to the meaning of freedom. It was, for a time, a pure and joyful and almost innocent friendship. No one sitting at that crowded table could possibly have guessed that these brilliant friends would one day become bitter public enemies. In truth, though, these two men were very different in their basic character, and maybe that difference was always going to matter. Camus was warm, emotional, and physical. He was, you might say, like the Mediterranean sun he loved. Warm and bright, yet always carrying a faint shadow of melancholy underneath. Sartre, by contrast, was cool, analytical, and relentlessly rational. He was a little like a precise and tireless thinking machine. One of these men felt the world deeply with his heart. The other dissected and analyzed the world coldly with his mind. And perhaps it was precisely because they were so fundamentally different that they would eventually drift toward a painful rupture. In those bright days, though, they were full of fire and confidence and hope. They drank together and danced together at parties. They argued together until the sun came up. They believed, sincerely, in a better and more just world that was surely coming. They imagined that their friendship would simply last forever, the way young people always do. But fate, as fate so often does, had very different plans. A thin crack slowly appeared between them. And then, year by year, that crack kept widening into a chasm. The deep problem, in the end, lay in politics. It was the dawn of the age of the Cold War. The entire world had split apart into two great hostile camps. On one side stood the Western democracies, led by the United States. On the other side stood the Soviet Communist bloc, led by Moscow. And here is the crucial thing. Many of the leading intellectuals of France sympathized strongly with communism. They dreamed of a future world where everyone would be truly equal, with no rich and no poor. They hated, with real passion, the injustice and the cruelty they saw in capitalism. At the time, this pull toward communism was an enormous and respectable tide of feeling among thinkers. Sartre was exactly such a man, and he was moving fast. He drew closer and closer to the communist camp as the years went on. He came to believe that, for the sake of building a far better future, harsh and even violent methods were sometimes simply necessary. Revolutions, he reasoned, can hardly ever avoid some bloodshed. He saw that bloodshed as a regrettable but necessary price to pay for progress. He was willing, with his eyes open, to stand on the side of revolution. Even though he could clearly see that revolution had a very dark side. He told himself that history, in the long run, would prove him right. But Camus completely and fiercely disagreed. And his disagreement came from somewhere deep. Camus had seen the cruelty of war with his own eyes. He could not, and would not, accept violence in any form, no matter how noble the goal behind it. He had learned the truth about the Soviet labor camps, the terrible system of prisons in the frozen East. Countless innocent people were being imprisoned, starved, and worked to death in those camps. Countless human beings were suffering and dying there in silence. Camus said, plainly and bravely, that this was absolutely intolerable. He believed, with his whole heart, that no ideal, however beautiful and shining, was ever worth the blood of even one innocent person. The gap between the two old friends grew deeper and wider with every passing year. One of them was passionately pursuing the great result, the future paradise. The other was holding fast, with both hands, to the moral principle in the present moment. One said we must first change the world, by any means required. The other said we must never, ever dirty our own hands with murder. The argument grew more and more tense and personal. It was like watching two continents slowly and unstoppably pull apart. Neither proud man would yield an inch. And the volcano underneath them was ready to erupt at any moment. In 1951 Camus published the book that would light the fuse. The book was called The Rebel. In its pages he sharply and systematically criticized revolutionary violence. He argued that certain revolutions, which had begun with beautiful dreams, had slid horribly into pure terror. They ended up murdering the innocent under the proud banner of high ideals. He openly questioned and challenged the revolutionaries who killed for their cause and told themselves it was justified. This book was, in effect, a public challenge thrown down in the street. And it struck directly at the most sensitive sore spot of Sartre and his whole circle of friends. Sartre's circle was absolutely furious. They felt attacked and betrayed. Sartre at the time edited a very important and influential magazine. The magazine was called Les Temps Modernes, which simply means modern times. The magazine ran a long, blistering review of Camus' book. The article tore into Camus mercilessly, line by line. The man who actually wrote the review was named Francis Jeanson. But absolutely everyone understood, in their hearts, that the article carried Sartre's full position and approval. It was an attack delivered with Sartre's open blessing, and Camus knew it. Camus was outraged and wounded. He sat down and wrote a long, formal letter in response. And here is the fascinating and pointed part. He ignored the reviewer Jeanson almost entirely. Instead he addressed his letter directly to the editor of the magazine. In other words, he went over the messenger and challenged Sartre himself, face to face, man to man. The letter was full of wounded pride and cold anger. He felt deeply betrayed by a man he had loved as a friend. He felt that the other side was being completely unfair and unreasonable. Above all, he was determined to defend his own honor and dignity. What came next was the fatal blow that ended everything. Sartre decided to write the reply himself, in his own name this time. And that letter was utterly merciless. It was also brilliant and razor-sharp, the work of a master of words turned against a friend. He attacked the pride of Camus directly. He mocked the lofty moral posture of Camus. He accused Camus of treating himself as the living embodiment of justice and virtue, looking down on everyone else. He said Camus was living sealed up inside his own small, self-righteous world. And then, near the end, he wrote a line that breaks your heart a little to read. He said that their friendship had never been an easy one. But he confessed that he would miss it. Those few quiet words announced the end of everything. The two closest of friends never spoke another single word to each other again for the rest of their lives. All of Paris, and much of Europe, watched the rupture unfold in real time. The newspapers and magazines discussed it eagerly, day after day. Everyone felt they had to take a side. Some people loyally backed Sartre. Others passionately backed Camus. Because this was never really just a private quarrel between two writers. It had become a public duel between two entire visions of the world. It was, even more deeply, a duel between two competing kinds of conscience. So who, in the end, was right, and who was wrong? It is a genuinely hard question, and I do not think it has an easy answer. Sartre cared most about actually changing the world and helping the masses. He was willing to dirty his hands for a great ideal. Camus cared most about holding a moral line that must never be crossed. He would rather stay clean and pure than win through compromise with evil. One man kept his eyes fixed on the grand sweep of history and the future. The other kept his eyes fixed on every single living human being standing in front of him right now. And the honest truth is that both of these men had real and serious reasons on their side. This terrible rupture also caused Simone de Beauvoir great personal pain. She and Camus had once been warm friends as well. But when the break came, she chose without hesitation to stand on the side of Sartre, her lifelong partner. And so, from that point on, the three of them became cold strangers to one another. A beautiful and rare bond of friendship simply shattered into pieces on the floor. This, sadly, is so often the heavy price of a clash over deeply held ideas. Time, the great judge, has given us at least some answers. In the years and decades that followed, the full truth about the Soviet Union slowly came out, piece by painful piece. The horror of the labor camps was completely and undeniably confirmed by the evidence. Many of the very people who had once enthusiastically supported communism came, in the end, to feel a deep and bitter regret. And seen from this later angle, the early warning of Camus turned out to be remarkably clear-sighted and brave. He had seen through the danger of totalitarian power very early, when it was unpopular to say so. He had held the line of basic, simple humanity when many others would not. Camus always, throughout his life, spoke up for human freedom. When the people of Hungary rose up in a desperate revolt in 1956, only to be crushed brutally beneath Soviet tanks, Camus stood up and protested loudly and publicly. He never stayed silent just to protect a political team or to keep the right friends. What he cared about was always each concrete, breathing human being. Not the grand abstract slogans that so easily justify cruelty. But please do not think this story has a simple villain, because Sartre had his own real greatness too. All his long life, he used his fame to speak up for the weak and the voiceless. He cared deeply about the oppressed, the colonized, and the bullied of the earth. He threw himself into all kinds of social and political movements, often at real personal cost. He even, famously, turned down the Nobel Prize in Literature when it was offered to him. That was in 1964. He refused it because he did not want to be absorbed and tamed by the establishment. He did not want to become an official, respectable brand on a shelf. He chose instead to live as a true and restless fighter. And his fierce passion moved and inspired countless people around the world. After Camus was gone, Sartre lived on for another 20 years. In his old age he gradually went almost completely blind, which was a cruel fate for such a great reader and writer. But even then he never stopped thinking and never stopped speaking out. He could always be found standing at the very front of the protest lines, supporting one cause after another. In 1980 Sartre finally died. And on the day of his funeral, the streets of Paris seemed to empty into a single river of people. Nearly 50,000 mourners came out to see him off and to walk behind his coffin. They packed the streets shoulder to shoulder, an ocean of faces. He had become, quite simply, the living symbol of an entire era of French thought. But the story of Camus has a far more sudden and sorrowful ending. On a cold day in January of 1960, Camus died in a car accident on a country road. That year he was only 46 years old. He was at the absolute peak of his creative powers, with so much left to write. He had won the Nobel Prize just 3 years before. And what makes the whole thing even more haunting is this small, cruel detail. There was an unused train ticket found in his pocket. He had originally planned to take the safe, slow train home. But at the last minute he changed his mind and accepted a ride in a friend's fast car instead. Fate, it seems, had played one final cruel joke on the philosopher of the absurd. And the two former friends, Camus and Sartre, never made their peace before death came between them forever. And yet, here is the part that stays with me. When Sartre heard the news of Camus' sudden death, he was deeply and visibly grieved. Even though the two of them had broken off completely years before. Even though they had not exchanged a single word in nearly a decade. Still, Sartre sat down and wrote a moving piece in memory of his lost friend. Real feeling poured out from between every line of it. He wrote that Camus had represented a stubborn, unbending kind of human and moral spirit in their troubled century. He admitted, quietly, that he had never really stopped thinking about his old friend across all those silent years. It seems that in the very deepest place of his heart, Sartre had never truly forgotten Camus at all. And perhaps, just perhaps, he had felt his own share of regret. So, in the end, what does this whole story teach us? Two true geniuses broke completely apart over their honest convictions. And here's the thing we must never forget. Both of them sincerely wanted to make the world a kinder and better place. They simply walked down completely different roads to get there. This makes me think of something important. A sincere disagreement, even a painful one, is not really a frightening thing in itself. What is truly frightening is giving up on thinking altogether. It is drifting lazily along and just echoing whatever the crowd around you happens to say. Camus and Sartre, whatever their faults, were at least both completely sincere. They both paid a very real and heavy price for the beliefs they held. In the end, absurdism and existentialism are really just two different answers to one and the same enormous question. And that question is this. In a world without any God to give us a purpose, how should a human being find the strength to go on living? Sartre's answer was through free and responsible choice. You are nothing more and nothing less than the sum total of your own choices. Camus' answer was through unbending, clear-eyed revolt. Stay fully awake to the absurd, and keep on loving life and people anyway. Both of these brave men refused, absolutely, to lie to themselves. Both of them faced the empty void with open eyes and real courage. And here is something beautiful that I have come to believe. In truth, these two great philosophies do not really contradict each other at all. We actually need both of them in our own daily lives. Sometimes what we need is the fierce courage of Sartre. The courage to bravely make a hard choice and then to bear its full weight on our shoulders. And at other times what we need is the clear, gentle side of Camus. The wisdom to stay good and kind even when we are standing right in the middle of the absurd. One of them teaches us how to act in the world. The other teaches us how to hold firm and keep our soul. The wisdom these two masters left behind for us still shines brightly, to this very day. So today, when you feel lost and small, when you feel as though your life has somehow lost all its meaning, please remember that these two great masters are still speaking quietly to you across the years. Sartre would lean in and say, stand up and go choose. Your one life is in your own two hands. You are, and you will become, exactly whoever you choose to become. And Camus would smile and say, keep on pushing your boulder, my friend. And be sure to push it with a smile on your face. For we must always imagine Sisyphus happy. Well, that brings our story to a close for today. The friendship and the bitter rupture of Camus and Sartre together form one of the most moving and human pages in the entire history of philosophy. It reminds us, powerfully, that ideas truly carry weight in this world. It reminds us that our choices always carry a real price. And it reminds us, too, that even the truest of friends can sometimes part ways over what they most deeply believe. So may we all, in our own small way, be a little like these two flawed and brilliant men. May we face our own lives with real honesty. May we bravely make our own difficult choices. And then, having chosen, may we treat the people around us with tenderness and grace. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. If you enjoyed this story, please remember to give me a like and to subscribe to the channel. And I would truly love to hear from you down in the comments below. So tell me, are you standing on the side of Camus? Or are you standing on the side of Sartre? See you next time.